Okay, I've got my initial drawing down. Now let's start rendering this thing. The first step is to pretend like you're only working with your brown on a white piece of paper. So start shading it. Everywhere you see shadow, apply a little bit of value. By the way, you don't have to crosshatch, and eventually the crosshatching is just going to go away anyway, once you've got multiple layers down. At the end, I might rehatch it a little bit to create a little bit of additional volume reinforcement. But really, this is just an easy way of applying layers of subtle value into your drawing. You can also use the side of your pencil and make your values a little more even. I like to hatch. Which is why I'm hatching right now. Let's throw a little bit of shadow underneath the neck. Like that. When it comes to hair, look, you can fill in the whole thing with a single value, just as a starting point. Again, I'm using my dark brown pencil, not the light brown, though you could, I suppose, start off with your burnt sienna. But this color is more neutral. It's going to have less influence over your other colors. This is a better starting color than burnt sienna. Okay, let's throw a little bit more shadow right here. Okay, next step might feel counterintuitive, it might, but you're going to have to trust me on this. I'm going to add white to this, absolutely everywhere other than the hair. Here's what it's going to look like. Take your white and go over your entire drawing with it. Now what I'm doing is I'm applying the white semi-transparently. It's going to mix into the brown that I put down initially to create a color that's actually pretty close to your shadow. This way. And then on the lighter side, it's going to help establish the value on the lighter side of the face. Okay, let's apply a little bit more white here. Okay, now let's go back in and re-strengthen some of our shadows. Notice that I'm not blending yet, at least not with my fingers. I'm blending with my pencil. So by layering one layer over on top of another layer, it helps create softer and softer transitions. The fact is, I don't have enough pigment down in order to blend effectively at this stage. I need to allow the pigments to build up a little bit before I start getting my soft blends. So just keep alternating your colors, and little by little your drawing is going to get softer and softer and softer. Now I'm going to reinforce my drawing every once in a while, so if I feel like it's in danger of getting lost, I go back in and put in some of the details. Okay, so we're going a little bit darker here, just a touch, reinforcing the eyelid here. Going this way, like that. Okay, this line actually needs to go a little further out that way, like this. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing with the white. So I'm going to go in some places where I see the value is a little bit lighter, I'm going to add a little bit more white. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm just focusing on the drawing right now and ignoring the color. This is a really important principle. When you're working in color, the first priority is always value, is always form. So pretend like you're drawing in black and white in the first stage. Just get a very, very solid brown and white drawing, monochrome drawing. The color will follow. Why? Because the drawing, the value, is always more important than getting the color exactly right. You can conduct a little thought experiment to determine the truth of this statement. Imagine a drawing where the eyes are exactly in the right place. It looks like the person. You captured some kind of psychology, but the color's weird. It's all yellow or all blue, or the skin tone is entirely unrealistic. That's still going to be a fairly successful drawing. Conversely, imagine a drawing where the skin tones are perfect, but goodness gracious, the eyes are not in the right place. One's higher than the other, right? Not placed in the socket. That's going to be a drawing that fails. Accurate color will never, ever save a bad drawing. That's just a reality. So focus more on the drawing. The color will follow. The color will follow. So long as you have a really, really solid drawing underneath. Okay. At this stage, I'm going to start adding color to this. I've got more or less the structure put down. I can add a little bit of white to the eye. Why not? Eyelids here. Let's colorize this. The color in the shadow is actually pretty close to what's already there. It probably needs maybe a slightly warmer color, maybe this kind of brown. Maybe it needs a little bit of purple, but it doesn't really need that much in order to get to the actual colors that are there. The first thing I'm going to do is use this slightly lighter blue to cool the shadows down a little bit. Notice how far back I'm holding the pencil. Really far back. It allows me to apply just enough pigment to nudge the color, but not overwhelm the mixture entirely. What else do I need? Well, maybe a little bit of the cooler red as well. Let's go a little bit cooler this way. And then I'm going to add a little bit of this warm brown. I'm allowing the values underneath to establish the drawing. Right? As you can see, I'm going over the whole thing. I'm colorizing it a little bit. Now let's do the same thing in the lighter values. So what are we seeing? Well, the skin tone needs to be a little bit more pink. We're going to start off by adding a little bit of yellow. This is our dull yellow color. You can see that once I start applying more and more layers of pencil, the drawing starts to soften a little bit. It starts to blend on its own. I start getting much more of a softened effect. Okay, and now let's use our warm red to give a little bit of color, a little bit of pink to our skin tone. See how the drawing almost starts looking like it's in color? It's obviously very far from being complete, but I've got a pretty decent start already. So the next step is to go back into my shadows and start getting specific about the colors I'm seeing. So I'm going to go a little bit darker here, like this. I'm reinforcing my drawing as well, so if I feel like I'm losing some of the structure, I'll go in and reinforce it slightly. Okay, and then I noticed that there's some areas that go a little bit lighter in the shadows. So there's a little bit of light catching right here. I'm going to use a little bit of white here to start lightening those areas a little bit. We have a little bit of light catching here. And a little tiny bit of light catching right here. A little bit of light catching here on her cheekbone. So I add a little bit of white, and now I'm going to colorize the white. Add a little bit of color to it. So every time I add white, I need to put a little bit of color into it to keep it from getting too pale. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing everywhere in the shadows. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. And then when we come back, we'll do almost the same thing in the white. We're going to get specific. Okay, now let's start building up a little more color in the lights. I'm going to use mostly a combination of these three colors: my dirty yellow, dark dirty yellow, yellow ochre, my warm red, and my white, plus a cooling effect, a blue, to add a little bit of gray, a little bit of neutral into my color. So I'm going to start off with alternations of my yellow ochre. You can see that my values are coming from underneath, which makes me not worry so much about where I apply the color. I'm kind of doing it everywhere other than perhaps in the eyeball. Let's do the same thing for the neck. Now, normally, if I'm working at home in my studio, not doing a demo, I would probably work on the hair a little bit, get the background, think about the general composition, but right now we're just focusing on the face. So just understand that this is not exactly the way I would do an entire fully finished, fully realized work of art. This is just a head study, basically. Okay, let's add a little bit more red to this, just a touch. There's going to be places on her face that go a little more red also, right? So her nose, right? Anywhere where the skin is a little bit thicker will tend to have a little more red in it. The forehead, usually a little more tanned, catching a little more light. It's going to have a little bit more warmth to it. The cheeks. And then to counteract all of those warm colors, we're going to add a little bit of blue. Where the skin tone is thinnest. So usually near the temples, you're going to have slightly purple skin tones. Around the cheekbones, we're going to have slightly purple skin tones. So what we're looking for is that kind of pearlescent quality of skin tone, the way it goes from warm to cool very, very, very quickly. Without the cool aspect in the skin tone, your skin tone is going to feel kind of fake. It's going to feel a little bit burnt, if that makes sense. Like somebody just came out of an oven or a tanning booth, just sprayed themselves with some kind of bottled yellow. Okay, now let's start establishing some details in the lighter value. We're going to use a combination of these two colors in order to get our grays in the skin tones. So some of the grays here, some of the halftones are those transitional areas between the lights and the darks, between the lights and the shadows. Here, inside the eye socket, maybe at the bridge of her nose here, we're going to use these two colors to establish. So this is my lighter brown, my burnt sienna, and my lighter blue. Let's start off with my brown first. And then we're going to gray it out with our blue, our lighter blue. So these are complementary colors of each other, right? This is blue, this brown is just a very dark version of orange. And as a result, they cancel out each other and create a really nice, beautiful gray. Now, depending on the general colors of somebody's skin tone, the process might be a little bit different. Darker skin tones have a different, might have a slightly different approach. But I think using this approach will apply to lots of different situations. So now I'm getting that little separation between the tip of her nose and the bridge of her nose, this kind of stuff. These really, really subtle, difficult to render halftones. So notice there's a little halftone underneath her cheekbone, underneath her cheek. Again, first put down brown, then to cool it down a little bit, use a touch of blue. Now notice how the drawing is getting smoother and smoother and smoother, little by little. The construction lines are going away. This is because there is lots and lots of pigment on the paper already, and it's moving around gently little by little and creating a blended effect. This is the main reason why I don't use blending stumps, because if I start using blending stumps, they're going to press all the pigment down to the paper, flatten my paper fibers, and prevent the paper from taking on any more pigment. I call that kind of reaching the point of saturation, the point where the paper just can't take any more pigment. And if I was holding the paper vertically, you'd see this kind of shower of pigment raining down. Guys, the pigment in these color pastel pencils, it's not great, meaning the pigment concentration. If I use really high quality like schminky pastels, you'll find that the pigments are a little bit stickier, the colors are richer, and then I'm able to blend a little more. These are a little bit chalky. You have to be careful about how much blending you do. If you start blending too early, the pigment's just going to start falling off. Okay, I've added a little bit of color. I've lost my drawing a little bit, so I'm going to go in and finesse the drawing, get the shape of the nostrils back a little bit, like this, right? This is a really important process. Every once in a while, when I feel like my drawing is starting to get a little bit squishy, or I'm losing something in terms of the likeness, go from color mode back to drawing mode and re-solidify your drawing. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm going back in and putting back what I lost in my last application of color. You might have to go through this process quite a few times where you're applying color and then back to drawing, applying more color, back to drawing. This kind of alternation, little by little, is going to create a more accurate image towards the end. So I'm kind of switching modes, constantly going back and forth between applying color and also fixing the drawing, getting the drawing down. Okay, so I'm going to work on this a little bit more. I'm going to finesse some areas. And then we come back, we'll go back in the shadows and talk about the very darkest and lightest of details. Okay, so I'm working on this a little more, trying to get some of the lighter parts of the face to actually look three-dimensional. I'm getting some of the halftones here. Now I'm going to go into the shadows and start getting some of the very darkest spots. I'm going to use my very dark brown and my dark blue to do that. So there's going to be some parts that go pretty dark and pretty sharp. Here. So just again tightening up my drawing little by little. And then I'm going to go in with my little bit of blue and neutralize. Okay, so my drawing is getting closer and closer to completion. I'm going to start working back into the lights and getting some of the really delicate value and color transition here in the cheekbone. Again, I'm tightening up my drawing a little bit. The whole point is being really systematic to go kind of from blurry to little by little crispier, crispier, crispier. I'm still not blending. This is not the very last layer, but I'm close. So I'm going to speed this up again. And then when we come back, I'll blend this down a little bit and then put in my finishing touches. Okay, let's put in some of the very, very darkest areas. So I'm talking about the value for the eyes, the eyelashes a little bit, definitely the eyebrows. So I am going to use black, simply because my brown and blue do not go quite dark enough to achieve the effect that I want. Be careful where you use it though. Black is a color that doesn't play well with others. It doesn't mix well, so if you're going to use it, be very, very selective about where you're going to do that. So I'm going to put it in just a few spots. When you guys are rendering eyelashes, don't make them overly textured. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm blurring them out a little bit, pushing them ever so slightly past. Don't draw individual eyelashes, it just never ever looks right. So draw the shadow of the lash, not the lash itself. When it comes to the eyebrows, I recommend doing the same thing, keeping the texture softer than it actually appears. So I'm going to blur all this stuff out a little bit. I'm kind of generally going the direction the hair is growing. I'm not making it as strong as I'm seeing it. I'm kind of blurring out the shape a little bit. Quite often suggesting detail will create a more realistic effect than trying to render absolutely everything out. Keep that in mind. Some of the best painters like Rembrandt, Velasquez, basically allowed their details to be reduced down to kind of blobs of value and light, which from a distance came together into detail. So one of the surprising things about it, especially late Rembrandt and late Velasquez, is the fact that when you come up close to their paintings, it's just a series of brushstrokes. Like the detail just kind of falls apart. So I'm trying to go for that effect with pastel pencil as much as I can. I'm not over-rendering the detail. I'm suggesting the detail rather than rendering it. Okay, I think that's probably the only places where I'm going to put black. For your very darkest areas in the skin tone, use your brown, and then recognize that skin is slightly transparent, which means that the very, very darkest values in the skin tone are going to have a little bit of red in them where the skin is kind of glowing. So that's what my cool red is for. I'm going to add a little bit of cool red to all of my very darkest shadows in the skin tone to suggest the fact that the skin is transparent. Okay, I didn't render the lips. Usually one of the very last things I do are the lips. So let's do that. I'm going to adjust the shape of the lips here because I've lost my drawing slightly. They just look like they're going a little bit too long. So the lips are a little more compressed over here and a little bit longer over here. Okay, at this stage I am going to start blending down my drawing just a touch. So this is almost the very last stage before I start polishing it off a little bit. Now pay attention to where you blend. Don't blend the whole thing down. Only blend where the forms are furthest away. So here, for instance, right, the forms are turning away. Blend it down a little bit. Don't press down too much. Again, if you press down, you're going to press the paper fibers down, and you're going to prevent yourself from putting more of the pastel down. So here, I'll tend to keep things a little bit on the sharper side. Right? This increases the sense of volume. By applying more texture on areas that are close to the eye, it gives an illusion that they're closer. Right? Soft textures recede back in space. Sharp textures, strong textures push forward. So not pressing down a lot, just moving the pigment around. Okay, last step, put in your sharpest highlights, your brightest details, and finish your drawing. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to speed this up, probably take this off camera a little bit, and when we come back, I'll make some concluding remarks. Okay, so now it's time to put in our very brightest highlights. I'm going to start off with the one on the nose because that's just the absolutely brightest one. I'm going to leave the highlights unblended, and I'm not going to make them pure white. Highlights always have a little bit of color in it, so the rule of highlights is white plus 1, white plus some other color. So I usually just start putting in white highlight. And then I'll add a little bit of color to it. Usually this pale yellow, but sometimes pink. If you just leave the highlight white, it's going to look phony. It's going to look fake. Like somebody made a little white mark on the skin tone. Highlights should have a little bit of color in them. A little bit. Again, don't blend your highlights down. Keep them crispy. Keep them sharp. Those are areas where the forms are often closest to you. Right, like the tip of the nose, the cheekbone. Right, leaving texture there will emphasize their closeness. Okay, so I'm going to work on this a little more, finesse it a little bit, and then when we come back, I'll make some concluding remarks.